look at all the amazing instruments that are in there. The exhibition's called BELA, which is the British Exploratory Land Archive, and it came into being as part of Venice Takeaway, which was an exhibition launched in the British Pavilion last year as part of Venice Takeaway, a project initiated by the British Council for the 13th Venice Architecture Biennale, where I was lucky enough to be co-curator with Vicky Richardson from the British Council. We sent 10 teams of people around the world to bring back ideas to change British architecture. Alistair, that worked on it as well here from the British Council, it was something that was, I think, really brave as an idea, just to not show British architects, but to kind of look at something that we do at the AA and at the Bartlett, where I'm sure many of you are from all the time in education. You look around the world for ideas that might kind of change the way you could do things. I think people really grew to love it, but in the beginning we were called neo-colonialists, amongst other things. But it was a great exhibition. It then travelled to Reba, and we're lucky enough to have Laura Allen and Mark Smout, who are senior lecturers at the Bartlett and have their own studio here tonight to talk about the British Exploratory Land Archive, which was based on CLUI, the Centre for Land Use Interpretation in Los Angeles, which is a really amazing place which gathers together all sorts of information about American land use. The same thing doesn't exist here in the UK. There's lots of hobby groups and organisations. My favourite hobbyist that you alerted us to was Dump Man, who is a sort of lone figure that sort of cycles around and looks in disused railway lines. And has he done caves? Am I making that up? He goes in holes. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. The idea of BELA was to sort of form a large archive to bring all these organisations together under one roof. One of the really wonderful things about BELA as well, about Laura and Mark's, and I should mention, Jeff Manow from Building Blog, who was their third contributor to BELA, is these really amazing envirographic instruments that they've made for the show next door, which measure and sort of interfere with the landscape. And they themselves become part of this amazing story about the landscape. And there are sniffers and drippers and capture blankets. In fact, the capture blanket captured a small child, which luckily was their own on Friday night. These instruments become part of a really amazing story. So you end up, just by their presence in the landscape, you find out all sorts of amazing things, kind of past and present, that you didn't know about the landscape. From copper mining to something I'd never heard of before, and I felt like I should have done, the Seven Bore, which is this huge kind of wave that people surf, which I think is one of the, I think when I looked up the website, it said the second largest tidal bore in the world. And we've got it here in the UK. I didn't ever know that. But the stories they tell about the landscape are really fascinating and wonderful. So I'd like to welcome them both tonight for more stories for your delight. So Laura and Mark, thank you.
Thank you,
I'd like to make an excuse for myself before we start, and that is that we thought we had another half an hour, which we were going to use, like an all-nighter, to be really, really prepared. And now we feel we're just slightly under-prepared, but never mind. So the BELA event, the BELA as an architectural experience and as a sort of motive to design objects and to think about landscapes is a sort of multi-headed beast. It exists in the form of these instruments that Ness just mentioned, as well as study journeys that we take, as well as ideas about thinking about how you might want to investigate landscape, how you could catalogue it, how the various groups who are interested in the landscape might contribute to its stewardship, or who actually owns it and what that means. And so there's lots of parts to it. So when we talk about it this evening, I think we're sort of going to be going from one area to another. None of them are sort of concluded. They all coincide with one another. They cross over with one another as we go through. So, but the inspiration for the whole thing is CLUI, and this is the sort of inauspicious door of CLUI in Culver City in LA. It has a sort of mission. It says it's dedicated to the increase and diffusion of information about how the nation's lands are apportioned, utilised and perceived. And I think in America that's a really big story, because Of course, most of it is very, very big, and it's very large distances from one place to another. And people do tend to stay on the east coast or the west coast or in the south and not really go into lots of these sort of unknown territories, which he is very interested in. It's a non-profit based agency, but so it remains politically neutral. It doesn't borrow money really off anybody, and it doesn't have to then provide research that certain organisations would be keen to receive. And that makes it really, really important as a sort of unbiased environment for organising ideas about how land's use could be developed in the decades to come, as well as looking at the sort of historical events that have caused it to be what it is now. So it holds lectures, it holds an archive of, a very amazing archive of information, and at the same time it does lots of research trips and has public exhibitions. So it does a lot in a very small space. This is Matt Coolidge, he's the director, and we took him as our, and this amazing archive, we'll show you a close-up of those drawers in a minute, as a way to think about how we might archive British land use. The difference being is this was started before the invention of the internet, and so lots of his information is very much separate from one another. It's held as paper copies, as maps, as newspaper clippings, whereas we could find almost everything we wanted to find on the internet, which is a sort of good thing, but makes it less sort of aesthetically pleasing. This is a shot of the kind of exhibitions that they have. This is one about survey equipment across the States, and not only the equipment that is used to survey, but the things that are left behind, tags in the landscapes that they leave, the flags and the posts that are peppered across the landscape, help people understand where they are and help a mapping to be created. They're sort of analytical tools for a surveyor to understand things. So we were thinking about who surveys things and who owns the British landscape, and started in the beginning thinking just about English heritage and the big bodies like the rail network, and obviously that is much more varied when we got down to looking at it further. So the Cluey Research Archive now exists as this searchable digital archive, where this is obviously zoomed out to the whole of the States, but at the same density it exists however far you seem to zoom in. And he keeps these records organised alphabetically, not organised really by type. So you get all sorts of strange coincidences coming together. Put together, you see things like nuclear bunkers filed next to killer bees, filed next to beaches, and it makes it diverse. And on the archive, you see all sorts of strange things. He's interested in any bit of land use that relates, anything that land use is about, how humans have altered the use of the land. So it's not about geology or just straightforward, unadulterated geography. It's really about how we have had an impact and continue to have an impact, and basically also how our impact in the past is reused and becomes more diverse as we take over this sort of palimpsest of the landscape. So yeah, lots of stuff about nuclear bunkers, lots of stuff about the building of the amazing infrastructure of dams and canals that run across the States. Ghost towns, there's plenty of ghost towns. And then these things which are amazing, the training sites. And obviously the crash sites in the Mojave Desert, which we come on to in a minute. These things which are amazing, stuff that's on the land which is there to be seen from satellites. And then there's the trip, the area that Jeff and Mark went to Cluey and took in a sort of doable area and thought about how diverse that could be in just a couple of drives into the desert. So here is the archive and starting to find out where the visit will be and mapping that out across the landscape. And here's the film. Do you want to do that? If it works.
So part of the Venice takeaway brief was that we went on a trip to explore some of these sites and situations. So as Laura had mentioned, I went with Matt Coolidge and Jeff Mano. Went for 2 days out in a car with those two, which was quite something. And we went, I don't know if you remember the map just previously, we went down to the Mojave and up to Lancaster and then back to LA. And we took in their desert research station that you can see here, which is Clewey's outpost. It's really just a sort of porter cabin in the desert where there's a few installations that have been dumped there. There's lots of acoustic installations. There's lots of installations to do with the age of the desert and man's interaction with the desert. So this is the ground you're standing on, which is about how many people have walked across those trails. And it was quite an amazing journey because, you know, I sat in a car and Jeff knows an awful lot about these sites and Matt knows even more, and I couldn't know less at the time. So I was just kind of sitting in the back and listening to all this stuff go on, but it was quite extraordinary. I'll just wait till we see another one. So this is a device that they've installed out in the research station, and it's for listening to sonic booms from the airport. I forget which airport it is because the desert around there is just littered with airports, some secret, some not so secret, and drone sites. And this is used for listening to the sonic booms for when jet planes take off, and you can point the instrument towards it, and then you can listen to those things. And what's quite interesting is that there's the USAF, the United States Air Force, have recently contacted Matt about having some of that data, recording some of that data that they've collected at Clewey, so they can listen to their own aircraft. This is an Aeolian harp. I don't quite know how to say it, I'm afraid, but I think it's an Aeolian harp. It's a nose cone off a bomber that's connected to a very, very long bit of wire that blows in the wind and vibrates this wonderful sound underneath it that comes and goes. It doesn't come and go very often, only when the wind blows right, but it happened to do it when we were there, which is rather exciting. So it's quite interesting listening to the harmonics involved in all that, because it comes and goes, and the frequency changes. So shall I just whiz it along?
No, leave
a
it.
Are they enjoying it, do you think? Okay. So this is Steve. This is an installation with Steve Allen. So these are sonic boom recordings that he's been making over the years. And all the X planes, which are the experimental planes, are kind of tested out in the desert out there, and a lot of them are incredibly top secret, and the Air Force aren't particularly happy that he's making this about it. This feels slightly different when you're in a porter cabin and it's about 45 degrees and sitting in. So then we made our way out to that's the Mojave Solar Project, which is 250 or 160 megawatt even solar array. And what was interesting about these sites, again, are the acoustic sensations you get there, because you imagine it's a completely silent experience going somewhere and watching it. But all these reflectors are all constantly changing their pitch. So those noises in the background, you can hear water being pumped around and then moving around very, 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 very slowly.
Yeah, just beyond that, there's a house way out there where a cop has like a survivalist kind of encampment. Yeah, it's pretty cool out there. Practically in his house. The pilot ejected and died on impact anyways, ejected too late. But because it was an F-22, which in 2009 when this happened, right, so they sealed off that area. They had drones surveilling the area for 3 months apparently. Really? To make sure nobody would go to the crash site while they cleaned it all up.
Going to go quiet. There you are.
Okay, so other sites we saw were things like this disused Air Force base, which has just been completely overrun by a tumbleweed, archaeology, meteorology, biology, whatever. It's all taken its toll on this abandoned airfield. And then this was an extraordinary site. This is in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and it's the Exotic World Museum. And it started life as a goat farm a long time ago, and then it became the world's largest exotic burlesque museum. I don't really imagine how you ever got there. And it's now a puppy farm. So it's kind of, you drive into the desert and drive past these gates, and you can just walk around these gates if you want. I mean, there's nothing around there, but it's quite an interesting site. And that again is one of the other interesting things about the Cluey database. Whenever you go into it, so you'll see an X-plane crash site next to a puppy farm that used to be a burlesque museum. So, yeah, do you want to
okay. So we started looking. We came home. We look at the UK landscape, and we're thinking about the sort of millennia over which that it has been altered by human use. Obviously, differs in scale to the US to an enormous degree, but the difference also is that 70% of the UK landscape is cultivated for agriculture, and in America that's only 35%. So it's a big difference in terms of the sort of barren nature of things. It's also in the majority owned by a very small group of landowners. So they're mainly aristocracy or private companies and institutions such as the National Trust, the National Parks, Network Rail, Forestry Commission, and the RSPB, and also the Ministry of Defence, which has an enormous amount of land, which it's selling off, actually. So each of these groups have a very distinct interest and specific agenda relating to their land use, and it produces this thing called stovepiping, which is an isolation of interests and separation of one group from another. And it also means that those groups and their interests are potentially also separated from the local users and the local context entirely. So we drew inspiration from a number of online resources about that, including things like Subterranea, Britannica, and Geograph, which is an amazing site where a lot of nerdy people take photographs of things and they geotag them and they put them on the website. And in fact, anywhere you want to go, you can find a really sort of bland photograph of a hedge of almost all of the UK. Also, places like the National Heritage List has almost everything also listed, and so does the English Heritage Archives and the Geological Survey. So it's pretty hard to escape a individual cataloguing of these landscapes. So we started looking at the type of land that had been altered in the UK in a less than pastoral kind of way, and found things like these spoil heaps. And what's interesting also about quite a lot of land use, historic land use, is it's now protected. As you can see, this landscape is a UNESCO heritage site. And what's interesting about that is it means that it's actually cherished, not just because of what it might look like, which is slightly obviously known as pointy and flatty, these two, pointy being the one on the left and flatty being the not so pointy one on the right. No, that is left over there.
No, that's right.
Okay.
Just what I tell you.
I think you're wrong, but never mind. I'll move on then, Mark, if you don't like that one. Other things that have, and obviously the nature of quarrying and mining in the UK has made an enormous amount of impact on the landscape, so much so you get things like the Beckton gas work heap, known as the Beckton Alps, which has now been slightly reduced, but this is the view from it, an entirely artificially made heap produced by toxic waste from the Beckton gas works, which is also now redundant, and it was used for a short time as a artificial ski slope, but is now being reduced but remodelled into another kind of more naturalistic landscape. And then we went on quite a lot of journeys up to Wales, where there is an enormous amount of land use impact. And you see things like this, which are on that side, right or left, you can see loads of spoil and quarrying waste that's just been spreading out into that lake. So this place here, Tanagrisha, is in the heart of the Snowdonia National Park, and you can see the slate workings and the remnants of that industry absolutely everywhere, mainly abandoned. And so much so that you get things like this, which are entire villages absolutely, completely made out of remnants of slate. So the paths and the retaining walls and the houses and the lintels and the anything fences of these quarrymen cottages is all made out of spoil.
Mention that even on the left there, that's your left as you're looking at it.
I see what you're doing there.
The roads and the gallery, they're called galleries, the sort of the terraces which go up the side of a quarry. So that the roads and the galleries are all made out of slate, and then projecting out of those galleries, they have points where winch, where they used to attach winches to lower slate down. So practically everything is made out of slate. And what it's like when you see these spoil heaps is that you see a big spoil heap, and then you see these rather conventional forms made out of the same material in it. I described it on Saturday. It's like it's like something you've done in rhino, nice and round, with a square bit coming outside, and then you just render it all in slate. It looks really, they're really quite peculiar.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know if it's good or bad. I'm not sure.
Don't encourage them. Okay. Do you want to do Denor with
Nobody try that, obviously. So here's another site, and this is a site that's sort of proved inspirational for the final project we'll show you, actually. And this is a site called Denorwick in Snowdonia, and this was as it says, a fast response stored hydro power station. So the whole of a large portion of this mountain you see here is hollowed out, and at the time when it was hollowed out in the 50s or 60s, I can't remember, 60s, it was the largest cavern in Europe, or the largest cavern in the world, man-made cavern in the world, or something.
Is it the world or is it Europe?
It's somewhere, some bit of geography. And what happens is that during the night when electricity is cheap, water gets pumped up into the mountain. And then during the day, when the national grid needs to meet peak loads, some of the water is released. And it's incredibly, I know you have to pump the water up there in the first place, but it's an incredibly efficient way of delivering peak demand. And it's called a store system, which is a short-term operating reserve, or a fast response plant. The problem being with nuclear power and fossil fuels, etc., and tidal power, is that they generally operate at around about 100%. A nuclear power station will run at 100%. It can't do any more or any less. And in fact, if it does any less, you have to dump the electricity into cooling towers and things like that. So if you need to balance the power output in the grid, you need to have something like pumped hydro, which is instant. And what's most interesting about that, I think, is the fact that it is a place that would be used to what's known as a black start, which is where if the entire national grid fails and we are without electricity, there's very few places in the UK that can restart the national grid. Now, if you have a power failure at a nuclear power plant and the generators fail and all that kind of stuff, you need a lot of electricity to get the thing going again. It's the same with a fossil fuel station. You need electricity to drive the hoppers to put the coal in, or drive the gas or whatever. But Denorwick, being a hydro reactor, hydro station, means all you have to do is turn a valve, and as soon as you turn that valve, you're generating electricity, and for a very short time, you can generate an enormous amount of electricity. So that inspired us, I think, a lot about this.
Yeah, this is sort of slightly in the wrong order. There is a sort of cluster of energy-related schemes that we have looked at. But just before we do that, just go back to the other things that map out and mark our landscape. And one of them, of course, is all the military stuff. You get things like these which turn out to just be sort of little oddities left in the landscape, some demolished, but mainly not. You might know of the listening walls in Kent, which obviously are completely redundant, but are now a kind of memorial and have not been removed. And so there's lots of things like derelict airfields, fuel dumps, hangars, and other bits of ancillary stuff. And then there's these wonderful things, the decoy sites. And the decoy sites, or some of them are called starfish sites or SF sites, meaning special fire site, is a place where the UK military set up decoy installations that would be used during the Second World War to fool German bombers. the Luftwaffe bombers. And one of them here, this is Richmond Park, obviously, and you can see that it's set up with lots of bits of structure which distract the bombers from seeing the lights of London in the distance, or the not lights of London in the distance, and sort of tempt them to drop their bombs too early. Also in this site, at the bottom right, are lakes that once were, which were filled in so that they didn't reflect and therefore didn't give away the true location of this piece of the landscape. So they used things, very well organised, bits of very differently organised sort of instruments of fire baskets and trenches and other kinds of sort of burning incendiary bits of stuff that would mean that they could see, you would see different bits of the decoy, and it would try and be like an open window, or it might look like a blast furnace, or it might look like some other thing further down the river. So they're very well tailored to try and sort of make this illusion. And one of the ones that you can still see is the Humber Estuary Cherry Cobb Sands site. And this is one that was built to try and deflect bombers from Kingston upon Hull. And they used just reflective water in this site, and that's particularly interesting because, of course, that's actually still left there. So they were using artificial pools, and there's some sticks, I think, that come in the next one. Yeah, these poles were also used to have fire baskets on top, and they were trying to distract from the Hull docks. And obviously, it was a very big advantage if you could get the bombers not to bomb the docks, but just to bomb in these places in the middle of nowhere. There were some very big ones down in Bristol. Any big sort of industrial town had a starfish site associated with it. Oh yeah, shall I do this? Right, so that's the type of thing we were up against, trying to work out what the significance of those sorts of sites is, whether it has a current significance or whether it's just sort of sentimental or historical. Whether these things are going to be preserved and therefore actually they'll just become memorials, or whether they will become reused. In order to do that, we made a sort of classification of landscapes, which is obviously sort of an initial idea about what they would be, such as invisible landscapes and ephemeral landscapes, such as abandoned sites or underground sites, military landscapes, which are both civil defence and also just memorials and bunkers and decoys, aeronautical landscapes such as airports or ex-airports, and landscapes of extraction such as quarries, there's plenty of them around, and forestry, and landscapes of power generations and logistics sites, and the commercial infrastructure and waste landscapes. They're sort of more contemporary problems as well. And to do that, we put together this package of stuff that was sent out to hobby groups. So rather than speaking to the main landholders, the Forestry Commission and people like that, we wrote to the hobby groups and the stakeholder groups who have identified that they have a specific interest in the landscape and who keep information and regularly sort of use the landscape that they are involved with. So they all got a sort of introductory letter and a questionnaire, and we asked them to send us back any leaflets they might have. Dumpman replied with a video. And the membership of their groups and any type of peripheral information that we might be able to use in the archive. What we discovered is that every single hobby group can't use a map, and they've got terrible handwriting. So we got responses from about 30 groups so far, and they are actually still coming in, and identified a few sort of interesting ones, and actually found that they're all rather extraordinary. There's things here such as the Pylon Appreciation Society, and I think that's quite interesting because it's an appreciation of something that quite a lot of the people in the country would consider to be spoiling the landscape. But they like to document it and to hold events and exhibitions of their photographs. There's also the Mendip Cave Registry. Cavers are enormously used to mapping their landscape and share information very freely on the websites. So they have quite a lot of Google Maps about not just where there is access into any cave, but also, or any quarry, but also about the way that water might flow around it, and who owns that landscape and how they mapped it, and their research is quite endless. And then up on the top there as well, there's the British Land Reclamation Society. So those are people who are interested in turning the landscape from what it was into what it might be. And then there's things like SABRE, and SABRE is the Society for All British and Irish Road Enthusiasts. And they are very enthusiastic. Not only do they photograph things such as abandoned roads, they also document how a road was first constructed and who constructed it, such as the poor relief roads. And then on that side over there, you can see their fantasy maps where they all feel that they could possibly, we could possibly learn from their experience of road use, and they'd like to reorganise all of the junctions on all of the motorways, and that's how they do it. And they draw their own maps and they submit them. Often they're really quite amazing diversions around things that they have problems with. So they're a very strange group. And here is Dumpman, and there he is. He's just in a hole. Who knows what that is? He's a man who likes to look at industrial archaeology, as do quite a lot of people. He's very into trespassing, and he's very into filming himself trespassing. And he's keen to have a relationship. Okay. Oh, he's keen on Motorhead. Yeah. How do you know that?
Because all of his videos have Motorhead in the background.
Okay.
That's really weird.
I haven't noticed that. Okay, so then here's these landscapes of infrastructure and of power again. We look at one of the sites we're interested in is the River Severn, and it's obviously a very rich, seemingly natural environment with very diverse landscapes all the way up from the source in Wales to the Bristol Channel to the whole of the estuary. And it has a very, very long history of tidal energy proposals which date back a very, very long time. None really have come off so far. And that's because of the touristic value of the landscape and also its sort of natural value as a living thing. So we were looking at how this sort of collision between the sort of desire to sustain these ecological systems and the political and social imperative of renewable energy might conflict together in one site. So we looked at thinking of what would happen if a barrage was put across. You can't quite see it on there, but all of the little blue zones are areas where they've thought about either barrages that go either all the way across the Severn or which make a sort of enclosed lagoon, all of which will be used to generate energy. And that's because the UK government have predicted that they want to generate, or they've actually sort of signed up to generating 5% of the UK energy demand from renewable resources such as this. So the other thing that would happen, because it's obviously a very tidal environment, is it will also stop the tidal activity of the estuary. And if the tidal activity is stopped, that has an impact on the natural environment, the mud flats and the salt marshes, and is very destructive of habitats. And that upsurge of tide, which brings in so many nutrients, is obviously just completely removed. So the other thing that would be removed is the Severn bore, and this is, as Vanessa said, the second highest bore in the world. The other one's in Canada, and it's a where's the stat? The Severn tidal bore is the second highest. The water travels upstream as far as 25 miles at a speed of 16 kilometres an hour, reaching 2 metres in height. And you can see people, every single bore that's of a high enough classification is surfed like this. And you can surf for an hour if you're good enough, and obviously that's what the draw is. They also have sites all the way up the River Severn where you can now witness that event, and a whole tourist industry has come up just to watch people surf on the bore. So if they put the Severn barrage across the Severn estuary, there would be no more bore, there would be a much more softened tidal flow. So we came up with these envirographic instruments. They don't look so clear, unfortunately, and they borrow from the visual language and instrumentation techniques of environmental and landscape surveying equipment, such as the e-nose, which samples air in extraterrestrial environments, and evaporation pans, which are used in meteorological surveys to integrate the effects of several climate factors. And they aim to contribute to our understanding of site conditions by measurement and observational analysis. So they both take a reading and then display that reading for the user to observe. They were used in a study trip up the Severn from the source in the Cambrian Mountains through mid Wales to the Severn Estuary in the Bristol Channel, where they were deployed to taste, smell and record measurable as well as ephemeral and ambient qualities of the environment. And that's because that river obviously is constantly being monitored for all sorts of things, including water quality, flow rates and levels, as well as living beings that are held in it. So here they are being set up in the site. The one on that side, in fact, all of those are the sniffer. I haven't got a picture of the other one, I don't think. Oh, there we are. And there they are in loads of other sites. The one on the bottom over there is the dripper, and they're both set up next door. So that's them on site in the very, very varied landscape of that 200-mile trip. And what was interesting about that is the wide range of statutory and non-statutory conservation designations that protect this kind of environment. They protect the wildlife, the natural landscape, cultural artefacts, and they inform local and national policy making. And these designations aim to quantify values of natural space, which is quite an interesting thing to think about. And they quantify qualities of beauty, and they look at that for both aesthetic and cultural reasons. So there's a lot of the observing of something in the landscape is a key thing to planners to observe whether they are happy or not with change. So one of the schemes that we devised for that landscape is called Instant Islands, and it provides a landscape of platforms that sit in what was once the intertidal river shallows and mudflats, and it's for migratory wading birds where they can feed and overwinter. And that's the RSPB are an enormous problem to the people who are trying to get the Severn barrage put in. And the idea of these is that they catch silt that's flowing down the river, they move it up through a series of gates and jets and channels and put it into that shallow bowls at the bottom. So the grey on the right-hand side is supposed to indicate mud. And they make these habitats that then can be flushed out seasonally. And the way we thought about doing that is via this model, which is a sort of responsive, interactive model. So you can see on the bottom one, on this side here, that there's a series of eccentric cams that when a handle is turned, move a surface, and that surface at the top there is made of layers of paper, and there are reflective things set underneath the model so that you can see the sort of shimmer of the water moving. It alludes to water moving. And then on the top of that, in the balsa model and the veneer model, is each of the individual pans and the networks of walkways that go around them, and you can see the gates and sluices that flow water in and out. The idea is that visitors both observe the birds as well as they see the hydrodynamic force of the river and the mechanisms that control it, because obviously the whole of the Severn is used for irrigation and drinking water and sewage. So it's a very sort of hydrologically altered landscape. The other one is this, the Severn Lesser Boar Maker. The idea of this is to recreate the sensation of the boar and to keep the touristic curiosity of natural phenomena. What it does is produce its own mini surge. It collects water from the river flow and pumps it up to this, which is the Garden Cliffs at Strand, the highest point on the river route. They're 30-metre mudstone full of fossil landscape. And from that point, water can be like a water clock. It fills up with water, and at a certain point when it's full enough, it tips up. These cradles at the top flip up, and they push water down, which drags those platforms that are tilted under the water surface, and people are walking around on the sort of peachy-coloured landscape there. And so you'd be sort of submerged momentarily by a surge of water that you couldn't surf it for 60 minutes, but you would be sort of lost in the performance of the river. Do you want to do that so I can have a drink?
Yeah.
Good.
Bars upstairs.
Water, I meant.
So moving on to some more prototypical survey instruments, and we were looking at, this one is the capture blanket. One of the sites we looked at for the capture blanket was this abandoned fuel store on the Isle of Anglesey. And in the 1960s, where most fuel and oil came into Liverpool through the Mersey, the Port Authority suddenly realised that they couldn't fit the large supertankers that were being made at that time into the Mersey. So the tankers had to be held outside in the Irish Sea, and the oil was pumped from a buoy onto the Isle of Anglesey, which was then transferred via the Stanlow pipe all the way to Liverpool. I've forgotten, what's it called? Runcorn, somebody in Runcorn, yeah. And but this was a massive undertaking at the time, and it caused a huge furore that there was a huge pipe was being channeled all the way through this fantastic landscape. And there was an enormous amount of opposition to it. And also the buoy system they had just off the coast of Anglesey as well was vast. There were 20 metres in diameter, these buoys, and they weighed an enormous 500 tons each.
Maybe you should say what that headline was. It says the Rape of North Wales.
The Rape of North Wales, yeah. There was a huge resistance to it at the time. So we were looking at the sites like this in Anglesey, which were polluted by hydrocarbons. So this is a plan view, obviously, of all these fuel stores, and the ground around them is heavily polluted with oils and volatile organic compounds and things like that. So some of the technology we were looking at for our capture blanket is shown here. You can see on the right and top left there's this process called air sparging, which is how you remediate soil quality and allowing for the evaporation of hydrocarbons. You pump highly pressurized air down into the ground. In this case on the right it's in an old fuel station, an old petrol station, and then you capture the air as it comes back up with a blanket over the surface, which isn't here. And this kind of removes most of the hydrocarbons. The item on the left there is called a glove bag, and it's used in forensic science. It's for you to allow you push those gloves in to the bag, and it allows you to fiddle with things. I probably wouldn't like to imagine what they were, but without actually touching them. They're held in quarantine.
We just like the look of that.
We like the look of that, really, I think, rather than anything else. We're also interested in the phenomena of cave breathing, which is the air pressure changing outside a cave to that which is within the cave, and it'll force air in or out of the cave. And we found lots of cave enthusiasts who hold ribbons and things in front of small caves in the ground and watch the ribbons either fly up or fly down depending on whether the cave is breathing in or out. So the capture blanket was a textile mat constructed of Tyvek and mylar and felt, and it had lots of rubber attachments to it that you could allow you to play with the landscape underneath it. And there was a wind-powered pump which would fire air into the ground and then it would capture the stuff underneath. And this is the item that fell off the ceiling during the opening night on Friday and caught our daughter underneath. Fortunately, she was sort of okay.
She deserved it. She
shouldn't have pulled it. I did tell her. Yeah. Okay, and here's it on site. So this is a kind of a close-up of one of those oil stores you saw from above, and there we are down there setting it up. It's an interesting object to get into. I didn't get any photos of me lying in it actually, but it's it's completely silent inside it, and it's a rather strange experience lying out in that landscape. And it's quite another site we used it on was this old fuel dump store in Suffolk. And I think this closed in 1943, but they haven't been able to build on the land because it's quite poisonous, and they're still contaminated. And then another site we looked at, which was incredibly interesting, was Paris Mountain, which again was on Anglesey. Amloch oil dump is top left from there, and it's an enormous quarry that was set up in the 18th century, and it was the world's most productive copper mine or copper quarry at the time in the world, and it was like the Wild West there. The local museum has images of people just rushing there and digging a hole, collecting the ore and smelting it, and then collecting the money, getting drunk, and then doing the same thing the next day. I think that's a kind of cycle that miners get involved in. But there's 20,000 metres of excavated tunnels underneath the site, and it's incredibly unstable. They only recently finished mining there about 10 years ago. I say recently, it was about 10, 15 years ago. And there are no plants that grow there because the soil is so rich in minerals. And this hasn't been photoshopped at all. It really is the most extraordinary landscape. You can walk around there, and they use it for filming Doctor Who and lots of other things like that because it looks so peculiar. And it's now been bought by an Australian mining firm who've kind of got the rights to about 5 million tonnes. There's still 5 million tonnes of high-grade ore in there. The demand at the time in the 18th century was for copper to line the bottom of boats so they could sail faster. That's before. That's so.
Should we do that one?
Yeah, done that one.
So this is going to be the clinometer. This is also about the sort of surveying equipment, and how that surveying equipment and how you use it is key to thinking about how you look at sites and what you might want to read from them. So it uses ideas from analogue and digital surveying equipment, including things like the radar corners that are used as reflectors for sort of more high-tech ways of reading the landscape. Also marking beacons and handheld kilometres, which are very, very small, which measure slope angle. So the other thing it responds to is the mapping notation, and if that was more high-res, you'd see that it has a lot of hatches and fills that are describing the angle of slope and the intensity of slope. And those also are mapped more orthogonally, and they're called graticule grids. So these sort of longitude, latitude and hachure lines are all coming together in the design of this landscape instrument. So it's constructed out of aluminium. It has weights on one side of each sheet, which obviously fall down with gravity to point straight down, and they are laced up on the far side with bungee cord. So the sort of cones that you see on this drawing relate to the swing of the weights, and on the left or right hand side over there, the little arms with eyelets in are on the far side of the weights. So as the instrument readjusts for different gravity and different inclinations of slope, that pulls the strings. Those strings relate to hachure lines, and it gives you a reading of the site. So that's the sort of lacing up of it in one orientation. Obviously, you can put those different shapes together in different organisations if you want to. Oh, maybe this is where it's going to be. So this is a place on the edge of the Blaenau-Festiniog slate mines, which was closed in the 70s. It's got loads and loads of abandoned buildings, and it's within the national park. So obviously that's a lovely bit of Welsh landscape, the Ponderosa Cafe. And here's some shots of it in the landscape. So obviously it's a very large instrument. So each piece is about, well, the big triangles are about 900 mil across, and so they can be read, and they're very reflective. They can be read at a very big distance, and they can be set up on, because it has a big footprint, they can be set up on quite steep slopes. So here they are. That's also a no Photoshop image. Oh, should I do that one?
Yeah.
So the Speleological Pantograph. Hold on a minute. Yeah. So this is we didn't position that slide very well.
No, that's good.
So the Speleological Pantograph is in response to the Nottingham cave network, and that cave network is extremely old and extensive, and quite a lot of it is only recently being mapped, although some of it is in constant reuse. It's being surveyed by the Nottingham Cave Survey. An amazing bloke called Strange Walker is the man who is working for the Nottingham Cave Survey and going about surveying everything, 3D scanning it. And you can see that there's quite a lot of part of the cave network that relates to pubs. It's being used for cellars, it's being used for shelters, it's used for storage, and it's able to be there because Nottingham sits on an amazing bit of sandstone which is very, very soft. This is part of the scan that we received from the Nottingham Scan Survey, and part of the bit that we designed our instruments for. So lots of it is actually in incredibly... Oh, here we go. So this is the a caving club, which is also in the wrong place, and it's looking at the instruments that these people make, the Shropshire Caving Club, and they make everything is handmade. They attach stuff to the back of their Land Rovers. They cobble together ladders and winches, and basically find their own way of exploring the cave. And they actually have a very long history of using digital mapping techniques as well, and adapting them for tight spaces and difficult places to access. Oh yeah, where's the quote on there? It says that they're experts in the field, which we query. So we put together a series of sketches looking at about what a speleological pantograph might be, and that's a Jeff Maynor word. Speleological meaning cave, and a pantograph being a way of putting together. It replicates. It enables you to size or measure something and replicate that size or that measurement further along an armature. So we thought about how that could be used if the cave scan produced digital software, produced digital images that you can move around. All the same, you can't visualize that space externally, and how that space might be externally visualized by the use of other more homemade techniques. These are the sketches for them. And these are the caves. So you can see that the caves, although they're quite extensive and pretty sort of formidable structures in the middle of the city, they exist underneath shopping centres, they exist in people's back gardens, so that's a council estate with a gate going straight down into the caves. And you can see at the top there that in the shopping centre there's a sign going to the lift, but there's also a sign going to the caves. And these are the sort of accessible ones, but underneath they look like that. So on the right-hand side, or left, over there, that is underneath the shopping centre. But this is the material that everything is being carved out of, this soft sandstone of the park tunnel, quite dramatic stuff. So these are the designs. They're the 3D scans of those parts of the cave. And the designs are made just as a series of sort of almost Victorian type of structures where winches, pulleys, weighted devices would enable you to sort of unfold and re-manifest the form of the cave on the outside space. Oh, Sheppy.
Shall I do Sheppy?
Yes, and then that's...
Okay, so the Sheppy Energy Reservoir, or spelt wrong, or the the Sheppy battery, it became known as, actually further through the project, as it suggests, was based on the Isle of Sheppy. A little known fact about Sheppy is that the world's largest wind farm is just off the coast of Kent in that area, as you can see here. It's called the London Array, and I think it's almost 1,000 megawatts of windmills that are out there. And all that power comes in, as you can see on the drawing on the left, the map on the left, all comes into just by the Isle of Sheppy to a place called Crew Hill. There's a farm and a massive substation. And this was fascinating to us because there's lots of landscape groups around that area. There's the Kent Geology Group and there's the Kent Butterfly Group and so on and so forth. And they're all interested in Sheppy because parts of it, and well, the marshes around Kent are quite low-lying or are being eroded quite quickly. And they're very, very susceptible to climate change and sea level rise and so on. When it's completed, the London Array, because it's still being made at the moment, it will provide enough electricity to power a quarter of all the houses in Greater London, which is an enormous amount of power. And the site is really interesting as well. There are lots of its. It exists a lot in literature. The original sort of David Lean Great Expectations is notionally set there, where Pip is captured by the other one. I can't remember.
You were
anyway,
paying attention.
And I suppose we go back to the things that that our practice really loves as well. This is a machine designed by Harrison Fisher, and it's a tidal predictor. So you would feed in the sort of lunar cycles and the heights of the water, and it would tell you when those tides are going to take place, and it would provide you with a curve to show when that happens. And we also became interested in these things as well. These are kinetic flywheels. So we'd learned about them in America. So this is outside, this is in New York State, the ones on the right, as you're looking at it. It's a load of flywheels that are set out in the landscape that balance out the energy production in that area. So as I was saying before, demand for electricity goes up and down, but it's very difficult for us to provide a sort of fluctuating power source. But flywheels can help with that. They are large carbon composite pieces that sit inside a massive vacuum, a really strong vacuum, and are held on magnetic bearings. So they don't actually touch anything, and they take a very long time to wind down. They were developed for use in motor racing. So the ones on the left are ones for racing cars. They were, and then in the UK they were developed by Williams, the people who make the Formula One cars, and they were banned a few years after they'd installed them because they were so incredibly efficient. But they're still used in sort of Porsche supercars, which is the one at the top left up there. And they can deliver an awful lot of power for a very short amount of time. Now, in sort of microgrid systems, this is used for things like wind farms that provide a very sort of fuzzy amount of power that comes and goes. That energy can be, when it's peaking, the energy can be stored, and when it's troughing, it can be released. And it can happen over milliseconds with a flywheel. So we were looking at the idea of the London array, and we're thinking about Sheppy and how the power from the electricity from the London array could be balanced somehow in a landscape, in a landscape instrument of some sort. Having learned about Norwich and learned about wind farms and reservoirs, there's a huge amount of opposition to wind farms and new reservoirs, even though they generally make not every time, but they generally make a lot of sense. So we were wondering what a landscape reservoir could be that might be acceptable in some way. So we thought about installing lots of those tiny flywheels. They work best when they're clumped together in cells, like lead-acid batteries. Yeah, like lead-acid batteries, they work best when they're all clumped together. Purely because of the fact when the flywheel gets larger, the rim speed on the flywheel, once it breaks the speed of sound, it can pull itself apart. So these little sort of grey circles here would be clusters of those batteries. Another thing we realised about Sheppy is that it is under enormous threat from climate change, and there's lots of discussions, as you probably know, around Kent and Essex about whether we should retreat from the sea or we should put an enormous wall or something in between. And managed retreat seems to be the favourite choice at the moment. But we were wondering about the possibility of making some buffer zone that would be somewhere between a wall and nothing at all, and thought if these flywheels could have their own accreting foundations that grow around them, that might serve a couple of purposes. It might slow the ingress of the sea, or might take the energy out of the sea. We came across this material called biorock, and you can apply a low voltage current to a submerged conductive structure like a piece of rebar or something, and it causes all the dissolved minerals in the seawater to precipitate and adhere to that structure. So the result is a sort of composite, I think it's called brucite or something, brucite and limestone, and it makes a material that's almost as hard as concrete. And the one on the right there has grown around a metal rod, and you can see how it kind of grows, and it grows quite quickly as well. So we were thinking that if you could make an energy sapping structure for the incoming water, and that could grow itself as a function of the flywheels, that would be the holy grail. And so we came up with this idea that the energy that would have to be dumped from time to time from these flywheels could actually be put into conductive elements that surround them, and so it would accrete its own sea wall. The final element to this was that we wanted the reservoir to be readable. Rather like when you go past a reservoir, you can see how high the reservoir is or how low it is. And the same with Norwich, you can see, you can go inside and see how high or low the water is. And the same with wind farms, you can see when they're generating power and when they're not. But we thought on this funny, misty, marshy land, it would be amazing if we could describe it as a lit cloud that would exist above the installation. So we developed this system of sort of lasers that would triangulate on a dot in the sky, and they would show just precisely how much energy is stored in those devices, how much energy is coming in and how much energy is going out, and it would describe it as a volume in the sky. And this you could see at very, very low level, hanging in the mist above this device, coming and going.
That's the last slide.
Is that the last slide? Well, that's it then.
Coming and going is your last word.
Coming and going
word.
is the last word.
That's everything. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Re-escape. I don't know what goes round on. John.
Can I do that? Thank you.
Credits.
Credits.
British Council, Vicky, Vanessa, Born Design, additional support from Bartlett and the AA for hosting the event. And thanks also to Sandra, who's in the audience, and Kyle and Johan.
Thanks, Sandra. And Kyle. I'm not going to ask the question how you both decide which is left and which is right.
I'm always wrong.
Does anyone have any questions for Laura and Mark? I can't actually see anyone in this.
There are people there.
I can see a hand.
Oh.
Yeah, and you did extend the project, and if so, how?
Sheppy, the Sheppy
Well,
one.
yes,
The whole thing, the whole of Bella.
we'd like to. There is only the two of us, though, which is a bit of a shame sometimes. I mean, we've had lots of help from lots of people in the audience, but yes, we would like to, definitely. I mean, we're a bit torn at the moment because we're being asked to extend some of the projects within BELA. You know, so it's difficult to extend BELA when we're trying to, develop the Sheppy battery. But we've been approached by a few people about the Sheppy battery, about taking it further and, and what we can do with it. So I think the idea would be that for the next 4 or 5 years we would do, that's a long time.
No,
isn't it?
fine, I'm
For 4 or
agreeing to
5
it
years
right now.
we would do projects under the BELA umbrella.
Yeah.
Bella umbrella.
Mm.
Does anyone else got any more questions I'd like to ask? No? I mean, I think you'll have Mark and Laura here for a few minutes if you want to ask a private question or suggest any sites that... I mean, you must be getting a lot of people saying you've got to go to this place, it's amazing.
Yeah, that happens all the time. We were interviewed yesterday for Radio 4 for Inside Science, and the woman had just discovered that they found a rhino in a hippo in Trafalgar Square, and started to talk to us about sort of archaeological sites that are under famous monuments and therefore can't ever be excavated. And so people are always bringing up.
So where was the hippo?
Well, goodness knows. Right, I like to believe that it's right under the column. I don't know.
An impaled hippo.
Yeah, I don't know where it is, but obviously we now have to look into that. So as soon as something raises its ugly head, off we go.
Well, it's
with a bit of research.
I mean, Jeff is
yeah.
constantly looking for those sites
Yes.
in his own private world on his
Yeah.
blog. So we're kind of revealed, they reveal themselves to us that way as well. So
Yeah.
he's the third
And I
member of
should
the
say
team.
we're trying to get Matt Coolidge from Coolidge to come and lecture here at the AA, and he'll be talking to Bartlett. So hopefully early next year, January or February, we'll have Matt to talk about how this all started.
Yeah, that would be good.
Great.
Yeah. Well, thank you both
Okay.
again. That was brilliant. And
Thanks.
thank you
Thank
everybody
you.
for coming.
Thank you. Do you unplug anything or not?